let me begin with something that I think requires us to immediately and completely dismantle one of the most persistent and most damaging misreadings of what the empath's quiet exit actually is. Because the cultural script we have inherited for what a justified response to sustained harm looks like is extraordinarily specific in its expectations. It expects drama. It expects the confrontation where everything that was suppressed for years finally finds its voice. It expects the reckoning, the moment where the person who was harmed delivers, with full emotional force and full moral authority, the accounting that the person who caused the harm has so long evaded. The script expects noise. And when the empath leaves quietly, without the noise that the script demands, the instinctive cultural interpretation is that the quiet represents something missing, some failure of self-respect, some residual attachment to the relationship that prevented the genuine, fully expressed rupture that the situation warranted. And I want to say, with considerable precision and considerable conviction, that this interpretation is not simply wrong. It is the precise inversion of what is actually happening. The quiet exit is not weakness. It is the completion of understanding so thorough that the noise the script demands has become genuinely, completely, and permanently unnecessary. To understand what I mean by that, we need to examine what the noise of a confrontational exit actually requires from the person producing it. Confrontation, genuine, emotionally engaged, expressively full confrontation requires sustained emotional connection to the dynamic being confronted. It requires the continued existence, at some functional level, of the hope that the confrontation will produce something, that the expression of the full weight of what was experienced will land, that the accounting delivered will be received with the recognition it deserves, that the reckoning will produce, even minimally, the acknowledgement that the relationship's entire duration denied. And here is the psychological truth that the empath's quiet exit expresses, with a completeness that no amount of confrontation could communicate more powerfully. The empath has arrived through the specific journey we have been examining throughout this entire conversation, through the absorbed darkness, the reclaimed sensitive, the dissolved and rebuilt boundaries, the nervous system's slow and honest recovery at a place where none of those hopes are still operative, not because they were defeated, not because the empath gave up on the possibility of acknowledgement after sufficient disappointment, but because the understanding they have developed of the narcissistic psychology is now sufficiently complete that the hope for acknowledgement has been replaced by something considerably more durable. The knowledge that acknowledgement was never possible. Not because the narcissist was unwilling, though unwillingness was certainly present, but because the psychological architecture that would be required to produce genuine acknowledgement is precisely the architecture that the narcissistic false self was constructed to prevent from ever fully developing. The empath who understands this, who has arrived at this understanding not through intellectual analysis, but through the direct, embodied, lived experience of having sought acknowledgement from someone constitutionally incapable of providing it, does not confront. Because confrontation with someone who cannot genuinely receive it is not an expression of the relationship's significance. It is an extension of the empath's own energy into a void that will simply absorb it and return nothing. The philosopher Epictetus identified the fundamental division between what is within our power and what is not as the foundational wisdom of genuine psychological freedom. The empath's quiet exit is this wisdom made behavioral. It is the complete and irreversible recognition that the narcissist's acknowledgement was never within the empath's power to obtain, and the decision, arising from that recognition, to stop spending energy in its pursuit. That decision is not the absence of strength. It is strength in its most evolved and most unassailable form now that we understand the quiet exit as the completion of understanding rather than the absence of strength. I want to examine something that gets to the very heart of why the empath's silence is not simply an alternative response to confrontation, but is, in the specific context of the narcissistic dynamic, a categorically more devastating one. Because the quiet exit's power does not come from what it expresses. It comes from what it withholds. And what it withholds is the single most essential resource. Source the narcissist's psychological system requires to function. Reaction. And I want to develop this with the clinical precision it deserves. because the relationship between narcissistic psychological functioning and the emotional reactions of the people in their relational environment is not simply a matter of preference or relational style. It is a structural dependency, a fundamental feature of the narcissistic psychological architecture that the entire system is built around, and that, when it is removed, produces consequences that go considerably deeper than the ordinary inconvenience of a relational disappointment. We have established throughout this entire conversation that the narcissist's sense of psychological reality, their felt experience of existing, of mattering, of having significance and weight and presence in the world, is unusually, almost entirely dependent on external confirmation through the emotional reactions of the people around them. This dependency is not a character flaw in the conventional moral sense. It is a developmental consequence, the specific psychological outcome of an early relational environment that failed to provide the consistent A2 full Ned caregiving that allows a person to internalize a stable, self-sustaining sense of their own worth and their own existence. The narcissist did not choose this dependency any more than a person chooses the consequences of a developmental disruption in any other domain of functioning. But the dependency is real. And its real consequence is that the narcissist's psychological system is perpetually, urgently, and non-negotiably oriented toward the production of emotional reactions in the people around them, because those reactions are not simply pleasant confirmation of their significance, but the primary means through which their psychological system maintains its most basic operational stability. The behavioral scientist B.F. Skinner's research on operant conditioning showed us that any behavior that is consistently reinforced, regardless of whether the reinforcement is positive or negative, will be maintained and intensified. What is extinguished, what eventually ceases, is behavior that produces no response, no reinforcement of any kind. The complete, persistent, unbroken absence of reaction that tells the behavioral system that the behavior has no effect on the environment. It is occurring within. This is precisely what the empath's silence delivers to the narcissist's psychological system. Not the negative reinforcement of expressed pain, which confirms the narcissist's power to cause it. Not the positive reinforcement of expressed love, which confirms the narcissist's worthiness of receiving it. Not the ambiguous reinforcement of any emotional response that can be interpreted, managed, or converted into supply through the narcissist's considerable relational management capacity. Simply and with a completeness that the narcissist system has no established protocol to manage nothing. And nothing, for a psychological system whose entire operational architecture is oriented toward the production of something, is not simply disappointing. It is destabilizing in a way that no negative reaction could approach. Because negative reactions, however painful their content, confirm the narcissist's power. They confirm the narcissist's significance. They confirm that the relational environment is responding to them, that they are affecting the world around them in ways that register, that matter, that produce consequences in the inner lives of the people Hey encounter. The empath's silence confirms none of this. It is the complete withdrawal of the confirmation that the narcissist's psychological system depends upon for its most basic stability. And in that withdrawal, in that total, settled, utterly unreachable absence of reaction, is the most devastating thing the empath could offer. We have established that the quiet exit is the completion of understanding rather than the absence of strength, and that the silence it delivers removes the single most essential resource the narcissist's psychological system requires for its basic operational stability. Now I want to examine something that operates at the level of the narcissist's most fundamental psychological need, the need that underlies every behavioral strategy, every relational maneuver, every defensive mechanism we have examined throughout this entire conversation, the need for narrative control. And I want to spend some time developing precisely what narrative control means in the narcissistic psychological context, because I think the full significance of what the empath's quiet exit does to this need is rarely communicated with the depth that would allow it to be genuine. Lie understood rather than simply intellectually noted. The narcissist's relationship with narrative is not simply about wanting their version of events to be believed. That is the surface presentation of something considerably more psychologically fundamental. At its deepest level, The narcissist's need for narrative control is a need for reality control, the need to be the person who determines what happened, what it meant, who was responsible, and how the entire relational experience is to be understood and remembered. This need is not arbitrary. It is structurally necessary to the maintenance of the false self's coherence, because the false self, that carefully constructed persona of superiority, specialness, and imperviousness that the narcissistic psychology erected in response to the unbearable vulnerability of the genuine self, depends for its continued functional integrity on a specific and carefully maintained version of every significant relational experience being the accepted version. The philosopher Michel Foucault, whose analysis of the relationship between knowledge and power showed us how control over narrative is never simply intellectual, but is always also a force. RM of relational dominance, the ability to determine what counts as true, what counts as real, and whose version of events carries the weight of authority, gives us the framework for understanding what narcissist narrative control actually accomplishes and why losing it is so specifically and so profoundly threatening. Every confrontation the empath has ever initiated with the narcissist has been, whatever its emotional content and whatever its ostensible purpose, an opportunity for the exercise of Foucault's narrative power. Every expressed grievance has been a narrative opening a moment where the narcissist could deploy their considerable relational intelligence to reframe, rewrite, and reposition the story in terms that protect the false self's coherence. The empath says, "You hurt me," and the narcissist converts it into, "You are too sensitive." The empath says, "This is what happened," and the narcissist converts it into, "That is not what happened." Every confrontation, however painfully the empath arrived at it, and however courageously it was delivered, provided the raw material for the narcissist's narrative management to work with. The empath who leaves without seeking the ST word removes this raw material entirely. They do not provide the confrontation that gives the narcissist narrative purchase. They do not express the grievance that the narcissist management system can convert into evidence of the empath's instability. They do not engage with the narcissist's version of events in any way that would give that version the dignity of requiring a response. They simply leave, and in leaving without contesting the narrative, they do something that direct confrontation could never accomplish. They communicate with a completeness and a finality that no argument could match, that the narcissist's version of events is not worth contesting. That their narrative control over what happened is not something the empath requires to be challenged, because it is not something the empath needs to be free from, because the empath's truth, their genuine, lived, irreducible experience of what the relationship was and what it cost them, does not require the narcissist's acknowledgement or the narcissist's defeat in narrative battle to be completely, irrevocably real. And a truth that needs no confirmation from the person who tried to erase it is the most powerful ninth of truth available. It is beyond the narcissist's narrative reach. And beyond their reach is the only place where the empath's story was always truly safe. We have moved through the completion of understanding that the quiet exit represents, through the withdrawal of reaction that destabilizes the narcissist's most basic operational stability, through the removal of narrative purchase that leaves the narcissist's version of events standing in a vacuum it created for itself. And now I want to examine something that operates not in the realm of what the quiet exit withholds, but in the realm of what it leaves behind. Something that is not about the absence of the empath creates through their departure, but about the presence, the specific, visible, permanently recorded presence that their manner of leaving imprints on the narcissist's psychological landscape, the image of dignity. And I want to develop this with the precision it deserves, because the psychological significance of the empath leaving at the height of their dignity composed, clear, without the explosion of accumulated pain that the relationship had accumulated sufficient justification to produce, is something that erates at a depth in the narcissist's inner world that most analyses of this dynamic do not fully reach. Let me begin with what the narcissist anticipated. Because the narcissist's anticipation of the ending their internal model of how the relationship's conclusion would unfold was shaped, with considerable specificity, by the dynamic that the relationship itself had established. They anticipated, on the basis of everything they knew about how the empath functioned within the dynamic they had constructed, a specific quality of exit. An exit that would contain the full, finally unleashed expression of the accumulated pain, the tears, the rage, the desperate last-moment bid for acknowledgement. The breakdown that would confirm, in the narcissist's internal narrative, the empath's fundamental instability and the narcissist's own power to have produced such a complete emotional dissolution in another person. This anticipated exit was, in the narcissist's psychological economy, not simply an expected event. It was a supply event, a moment where the empath's final, most comprehensive expression of pain would constitute the ultimate confirmation of the narcissist's significance, power, pull, and centrality in the empath's emotional world. The psychologist Roy Baumeister, whose research on ego threat and the specific forms of psychological harm that challenge the self-concept most severely, identified what he called the threatened egotism response, the specific intense, sometimes violent psychological reaction that occurs when an anticipated confirmation of one's own significance is not only withheld, but replaced by its categorical opposite. Not simply the absence of confirmation, but the presence of something that actively contradicts the self-concept that the confirmation was supposed to validate. The empath's quiet dignity is precisely this categorical opposite. Where the narcissist anticipated breakdown, they encounter composure. Where they anticipated desperate final bids for acknowledgement, they encounter the complete absence of any bid, the embodied communication that no acknowledgement is being sought because none is required. Where they anticipated the confirmation of their power to devastate, they encounter the evidence of a person who, having been subjected to what was intended to be devastating, has arrived at the exit point in a state that is not only you, whole, and destroyed, but visibly, unmistakably, unassailably whole. And this wholeness, this specific, composed, dignity-saturated quality of the empath's departure does something to the narcissist's internal narrative that no confrontation, however devastating in its content, could accomplish. It contradicts the narrative at its most foundational level. The narrative that the empath was diminished by the relationship, that the narcissist's treatment of them had produced the reduction in the empath's self-concept and self-worth that the treatment was designed to produce, that the person leaving was leaving as less than they arrived. The empath's dignified exit makes this narrative immediately, visibly, and permanently untenable, not through argument, not through counter-narrative, through the simple, unassailable, permanently recorded evidence of their own bearing at the moment of departure. We have traced the quiet exit through 4 dimensions: the completion of understanding, the withdrawal of reaction, the removal of narrative purchase, and the permanent image of dignity that no subsequent narrative reconstruction can displace. And now I want to examine something that operates not in full, the moment of the exit itself, but in what the exit sets in motion, something that begins the moment the empath redirects the extraordinary energetic and psychological resources that the narcissistic relationship consumed, and that produces consequences in the narcissist's inner world that are in many ways more confronting and more enduring than any of the immediate effects of the departure itself. The energy returns to the empath, and the narcissist feels its absence immediately. And I want to develop this with some precision because what I am describing goes considerably beyond the ordinary supply disruption that any significant relational ending produces in the narcissist's psychological system. We have examined supply disruption in other contexts, the narcissist's response to the withdrawal of attention, of emotional engagement, of the ordinary relational resources that supply management requires. What I am describing now is something categorically different from ordinary supply disruption, something that reflects not simply the loss of a supply source, but the loss of a specific and irreplaceable quality of energetic presence that the empath's extraordinary psychological architecture made available in a form that no other supply source in the narcissist's relational environment can replicate. To understand what made the empath's energetic presence so specifically and so irreplaceably significant, we need to return to something foundational about what the empath brought to the relationship that distinguished their presence from the presence of less empathetically constituted supply sources. The empath's extraordinary sensitivity, their neurologically rooted capacity to perceive, receive, and genuinely respond to the full complexity of another person's inner world, meant that their engagement with the narcissist was not the surface level, impression managed, essentially transactional engagement that most of the narcissist's relational interactions involve. The empath saw the narcissist. Not simply the performance of the false self, not simply the grandiosity and the entitlement and the carefully managed presentation of exceptional specialness that the narcissist's social environment typically receives and reflects back. The empath perceived, with the specific depth and accuracy that their perceptual architecture makes possible, something closer to the whole, actual person beneath the performance, the genuine wound, the frightened self behind the armor. The real human complexity that the false self's construction was designed to permanently conceal. And being seen at that level, being perceived with that quality of depth and accuracy by someone whose perception was genuine rather than performed, provided the narcissist's deeper self with something that no other supply source in their relational economy could provide. Not simply the confirmation of the false self's superiority and specialness. Something more intimate than that. Something closer to the experience of being actually known, however threatening that knowing was, however much the defensive architecture worked to prevent its full development by another consciousness whose knowing was extraordinary in its depth and its accuracy. The philosopher Martin Buber's distinction between I-thou and I-AT relationships, between the genuine encounter of two full subjects and the instrumentalization of the other as an object of use, illuminates what the empath provided that was categorically different from ordinary supply. The empath, by the nature of their perceptual architecture, old not entirely reduced the narcissist to an I-it object, even within a dynamic that consistently reduced them to one. Their seeing was irreducibly genuine, and genuine seeing, even when the person being seen cannot fully receive or reciprocate it, constitutes a quality of relational nourishment that the deeper self recognizes and depends upon in ways that instrumentalized supply simply cannot replicate. When the empath takes that seeing back, when the quiet exit removes from the narcissist's relational environment the one consciousness that was perceiving them with genuine depth, the loss is not simply the loss of a supply source. It is the loss of the closest approximation to genuine being known that the narcissist's psychology had ever been permitted to experience. And that loss registers with a specificity and an intimacy that no subsequent supply acquisition can address. In the precise location where the narcissist's genuine need for genuine knowing lives, we have now traced 5 dimensions of why the empath's quiet exit constitutes something far more psychologically significant than any confrontational departure could produce: the completion of understanding, the withdrawal of reaction, the removal of narrative purchase, the permanent image of dignity, and the return of a quality of energetic presence that no subsequent supply source can replicate. And now I want to examine what happens in the narcissist's inner world as the reality of the empath's permanent absence begins, with increasing and unavoidable clarity, to assemble itself into something that the ordinary defensive strategies cannot indefinitely prevent. The realization arrives, too late, and with a quality of finality that makes it the most confronting psychological experience the narcissist's relationship with this particular person has produced. And I want to approach this carefully because the specific quality of too late realization that the empath's quiet exit eventually produces in a narcissist is something that deserves examination with both clinical precision and genuine compassion. Not compassion that excuses what preceded it. Not compassion that suggests the realization warrants the empath's return or constitutes grounds for renewed engagement, but compassion for the specific, genuinely painful quality of arriving at understanding after the moment when understanding could have changed anything has permanently passed. The psychologist Daniel Kahneman, whose foundational work on decision-making and cognitive bias illuminated how human beings assess value, identified what he called the Pekind rule, the tendency for the overall evaluation of an experience to be determined not by its average quality across its duration, but by its most intense moment and its ending. What Kahneman's research showed us is that how an experience ends shapes the entire retrospective assessment of what the experience was, giving the ending a disproportionate weight in the psychological accounting of what the experience meant and what it was worth. The empath's quiet exit, in the context of Kahneman's framework, produces a specific and psychologically significant reorientation of the narcissist's retrospective assessment of the entire relationship. Because the ending, quiet, composed, unreachable, permanently final, does not conform to the narrative that the narcissist's psychological system had been constructing about what the relationship was and what the empath represented within it. The narrative that positioned the empath as someone whose emotional investment in the narcissist was so comprehensive and so dependent that their departure would be loud, desperate, and ultimately temporary. The narrative that converted the empath's extraordinary depth of caring into evidence of the empath's need for the narcissist, rather than evidence of the empath's extraordinary capacity for care. The quiet exit shatters this narrative with an efficiency that nothing else could approach. Because the empath who leaves quietly, finally, and without looking back is not behaving like someone whose caring made them dependent. They are behaving like someone whose caring was always, at its deepest level, an expression of their own abundant inner world rather than a need for the narcissist to complete them. And this behavioral evidence, the exit's composure as testimony to the empath's fundamental self-sufficiency, forces a retrospective reinterpretation of everything that preceded it. The caring that the narcissist understood as dependency reveals itself, in the light of the quiet exit, as generosity. The patience that the narcissist experienced as weakness reveals itself as extraordinary strength. The sensitivity that the narcissist pathologized as instability reveals it. Self as the most sophisticated form of human intelligence available to either person in that relationship. And the narcissist understands, with the specific, irreversible, too-late quality of genuine realization, that what they had, what they were given access to by a person of extraordinary depth and extraordinary caring, was not ordinary, was not replaceable, was not the kind of thing that the relational marketplace offers with any regularity or any reliability, was, in the most precise and most painful sense, exactly what they needed and exactly what they failed to value until the moment when valuing it could no longer change anything we have now traced 6 dimensions of the quiet exit's psychological significance, and each one has revealed a different facet of why this particular departure is not simply an ending, but a transformation. The understanding that required no confrontation to be complete. The silence that required no defense to be devastating. The narrative that required no contest to be true. The dignity that required no announcement to be permanent. The energy that required no explanation to be missed. The realization that required no return to be understood. And, now I want to examine what I believe is, in terms of its long-term psychological impact and its enduring significance for the empath's own healing and flourishing, the most important dimension of the quiet exit's power. Not what it does to the narcissist, though. That dimension is real and worth understanding. What it does for the empath. What it initiates in the empath's own psychological landscape that no other form of exit could have produced with equivalent completeness or equivalent durability. The healing that becomes the statement. And I want to develop this carefully, because there is a specific and important distinction between what I am describing and the familiar narrative of visible post-breakup thriving that most people in this audience will recognize from the cultural landscape of relationship recovery, the public flourishing, the ostentatious wellness, the carefully documented journey of recovery that is performed for the consumption of the person who caused the harm, engineered to be visible, designed to communicate, organized around the production of a specific effect in the specific person whose awareness of the empath's flourishing constitutes the point of the full exercise. That performance is not what I am describing, and the distinction matters enormously. The empath's healing that becomes the most powerful statement they never made is not performed for anyone. It is not engineered for visibility or organized around the narcissist's awareness of it. It is simply the natural, unperformed, entirely authentic consequence of an extraordinary person finally redirecting the full force of their extraordinary psychological resources, their extraordinary sensitivity, their extraordinary capacity for meaning-making, their extraordinary depth of feeling and processing and integration toward themselves and toward the life they are building in the complete absence of the dynamic that required their self-erasure as the price of participation. The psychologist Viktor Frankl, whose concept of meaning-making as the most fundamental human motivational force produced one of the most enduring frameworks for understanding how people transform suffering into something beyond mere survival, showed us that the most profound form of human resilience is not the simple absence of further harm after the original harm has ended. It is the conversion of the experience. CE of harm, its specific content, its particular texture, the exact nature of what it cost and what it taught into something that generates genuine meaning in the life that follows it. The empath who has survived narcissistic harm carries raw material for exactly this kind of meaning-making in a form and a quantity that few other experiences could provide. The specific knowledge of the narcissistic dynamic from its most interior perspective. The hard-won, body-level, essentially undecivable wisdom about the difference between genuine love and its performance. The rebuilt boundaries that were forged in the specific heat of having lived without them inside a relationship that exploited their absence with precision. The reclaimed sensitivity that is now directed with discernment rather than deployed with indiscriminate generosity. All of this, everything the narcissistic relationship produced in the empath through the specific mechanism of its harm, is now available to the empath as the foundation of a life that is not simply recovered, but genuinely transformed. And the life that is built from this foundation has a quality that is perceptible in its depth, its authenticity, specific kind of hard-won wisdom and unperformative wholeness to anyone who encounters it, including, eventually, the narcissist. Who witnesses the flourishing not as a performance directed toward them, but as something considerably more confronting, as evidence, quietly and completely assembled in their absence, of everything the empath was always capable of becoming when the dynamic that required their diminishment was no longer consuming the resources that becoming required, and so we arrive at the final and most essential truth of everything we have examined today. The one that holds the complete weight of this entire conversation and that once fully understood, permanently reframes not just the empath's quiet exit, but the entire trajectory of what the empath becomes in the aftermath of everything they survived. We have moved through 7 dimensions of why the quiet exit is the most powerful response available to the empath, and in each dimension we have been circling with increasing proximity towards something that I want to name now with full precision and full honesty. The quiet exit is not revenge, and that is precisely what makes it, for the narcissist, worse than revenge could ever be. I want to develop this distinction with care, because I think it is the most psychologically significant insight in this entire conversation, and the one most likely to be misunderstood if it is not handled with the specificity it deserves. Because the title of what we are examining today suggests revenge. And throughout our examination, we have been cataloging the various ways in which the quiet exit produces consequences in the narcissist psychological landscape that are more devastating than anything confrontational revenge could generate. The destabilization, the too late realization, the permanent image of dignity, the irreplaceable energetic absence. But here is the critical distinction. Every one of those consequences is a byproduct, a consequence that the quiet exit produces not because the empath designed it to produce them, not because the empath departed with the deliberate intention of inflicting the specific psychological harm that the exit generates, but because the empath departed with no intention directed toward the narcissist whatsoever, with their intention directed entirely, completely, and permanently elsewhere, toward themselves. The philosopher Hannah Arendt, whose concept of action as the highest form of human freedom, identified the capacity to initiate something genuinely new to begin, through deliberate and self-directed action, a course of events that would not have occurred without that initiation, described the most profound form of human freedom as not the freedom from constraint, but the freedom to begin. to introduce something unprecedented into the world through the exercise of genuine autonomous will. The empath's quiet exit is precisely this kind of beginning. It is not organized around the narcissist's experience of it. It is not structured as a response to what the narcissist did, calibrated as a punishment for what the narcissist deserves, or designed as a communication of what the narcissist failed to value. It is organized entirely around the empath's own life, around the unprecedented, self-directed, genuinely autonomous beginning of a chapter that was not possible inside the dynamic, and that becomes possible the moment the empath steps outside it with the completeness and the finality that the quiet exit delivers. And this is what makes it, for the narcissist, more confronting than revenge. G. Revenge keeps the avenger connected to the person being revenged upon through the thread of their anger, their desire for the other's suffering, their continued emotional orientation toward the other's experience as the measure of their own satisfaction. Revenge is, at its psychological foundation, still organized around the person who caused the harm, still giving that person the central position in the avenger's emotional and psychological landscape, still confirming, through the very act of seeking their suffering, that their reactions and their experiences and their awareness of consequence remain relevant to the empath's inner world. The empath who leaves quietly and redirects entirely toward their own life removes a narcissist from this central position with a completeness that revenge could never produce. Because indifference, genuine, unperformed, not directed toward you indifference is not simply more painful than revenge for the narcissist, whose psychological survival depends on being at the center of other people's emotional experience. It is the one response their system has no framework to manage, no defense designed to withstand, no countermove adequate to address. You cannot fight indifference. You cannot reframe it. You cannot convert it into supply. You cannot weaponize it back against the person expressing it. You can only sit with what it communicates, that you are no longer significant enough to be worth the empath's emotional energy in any form, including the form of anger, and discover that sitting with that communication is the most uncomfortable thing their psychology has ever been required to do. The empath did not leave to hurt them. They left to heal. And healing, genuine, unperformed, self-directed, abundant healing, turned out to be the one thing the narcissist's psychology was completely and permanently unprepared to survive encountering. They did not leave to destroy you, they left to become themselves. And it turned out that watching someone become fully themselves, after everything you did to prevent it, was the most devastating thing you would ever be required to witness.